Okay, good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I am Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are welcoming one of our favorite progressives, Bhaskar Sunkara. He is not only the founder and editor of Jacobin magazine, he is also the president of The Nation magazine and publisher of Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy. He is the former vice chair of the Democratic Socialists of America, and at 17, he was the editor of DSA's youth blog, The Activist. He was named Fortune magazine's 40 Under 40 list under the government and politics category. He describes Jacobin magazine as a radical publication, and I think we would all agree. I see him as a young public intellectual, a brilliant analyst and speaker, and he has created one of the most important political journeys in existence today, filled with well-researched history, policy, and captivating art. Sunkara's Jacobin magazine has proven that print journalism is far from dead. In fact, it has inspired a whole new generation of readers. He's also the author of the ABCs of Socialism and the Socialist Manifesto. I will show, here's the book, which is excellent, and I highly recommend it to everybody, as well as I recommend becoming subscribers of Jacobin magazine. John, who's assisting, is putting all that information in the chat box. So welcome, Bhaskar. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to be with you.
Well, it's great. One of the questions I wanted to ask you first, it's kind of simple in a way, but it's something we've been talking about a lot. And that is, I wanted to get your ideas on the expansion of the Supreme Court, what that might look like, and the abolishment of the filibuster. How do you see those and how do you see supporting that? I assume you agree with them, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I'm for all sorts of democratic reform. I think the United States is a unique country among advanced capitalist democracies in that we're not really a functional democracy. We're closer to a semi-authoritarian state like Singapore when it comes to how our system is set up to enable minority rule. And I think reducing the power of the courts is a major part of it. I think at the very least, reducing the filibuster, but then also in the long run, getting rid of the Senate would be part of it. But the real question is how we win over a social base to enact the type of constitutional reform that we need in the United States. So, in other words, I'm wary of an excessive focus on the courts as opposed to a focus on building a social majority behind whatever demands we have that are the most popular. So if you already have mobilized millions of people behind the demands around justice, Medicare for all, whatever the program is, then you say, we need to pass these things no matter what, and we need to get rid of any barriers to passing these things, then you don't sidestep the question of constitutional reform, but you embed it in a process where you say, here's why we need it. We need it to carry out our agenda. I think there's a portion of the Democratic Party that's a little bit too focused on just talking about the courts and just talking about the need for constitutional reform without tying it to this wider social question. Because right now, maybe you can imagine a future in which there's no filibuster. Unfortunately, I think it's probably going to happen in a period of Republican rule, which honestly would be, I think, obviously, in the long run, I think it would be good for American democracy to get rid of it. But there's a wider crisis that's going to happen in American democracy just from the fact that there's too many veto points in our system. We're going to have almost permanent divided government. We're going to have minority rule, which more or less is okay for Republicans. Like, look at how much Republicans have been able to get of their agenda just being in opposition without any branch of government in recent years, in recent months, especially with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But for socialist politics, for any sort of left-wing progressive politics, whether you consider yourself a socialist or a social democrat, whatever else, you really need a majority, and you need to rally people behind you who currently aren't engaged that much day to day in politics. And I worry that calls for reform of the constitutional system by themselves, isolated, won't be enough to do it.
So that would be the Supreme Court, or even changing the structure of the Senate, which one of the things we've talked about in previous programs is the fact that Wyoming has as much power as California, and yet they only have 500,000 residents and we have 39 million. And as
Right.
you're saying, that enables the minority to rule.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously the electoral college is one part of it that's going to happen again and again in our lives. And it's not just Wyoming versus California. I mean, there's even a question, obviously, of Washington, D.C. too, which has quite a bit more people. I think it may be 700, 800,000 people within its borders. So more than Wyoming itself, disproportionately Black Americans, totally disenfranchised in the US. So I 100% believe in the moral case for abolishing the Senate, for packing the courts and reducing the power of the Supreme Court, and a host of other reforms. The real question is, how do we build a base for it? So with DC statehood, obviously statehood for Puerto Rico is always a fraught issue on the left, in part because I think ideally we would want a transition to a free, independent Puerto Rico that has the ability to sustain itself economically. But it's whatever. Self-determination means self-determination. So whatever the people of Puerto Rico want. But all these sorts of things, some parts of it can be done without a big push. Ending the filibuster too, I think, can be done potentially without a huge push. But I'm weary of a Democratic Party politician or any sort of progressive politician running primarily on the issue of structural reform. I think we have to convince people that there's a reason why we need power. There's a reason why elections should matter, and that's because we're going to deliver the type of change that's going to fundamentally change the lives of millions of people in the United States, and that comes from a core bread and butter kind of economic program. It comes from having a social agenda, but taking the abstract issue of constitutional reform that might motivate activists like us and turning it into something tangible for ordinary people.
One of the things you mentioned a lot in your book, The Socialist Manifesto, and in other things that I've read by you, you talk about a labor-centric politics and how important that is to bring the working class back into the Democratic Party. But at the same time, we need to not lose the environmentalists. So it's like it seems like we need to build some sort of a coalition that's labor and environment or climate connected, that they both can support each other rather than be at odds with each other. Do you see that as a possibility? I think Bernie really addressed that to some extent when he was running for president. Wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the initial goal of the Green New Deal was a way to bridge the two together. I'm not sure to what extent it's worked, in that I think the Green New Deal has become more of an activist cause and an environmentalist cause than one that's won over the type of people that it needs to win over. I think there's a lot of cynicism, in part because jobs that exist now around fossil fuel industries, jobs that exist in places like Pennsylvania around fracking, these are real, tangible jobs, whereas the jobs that we believe, or we know that the state could help create around new renewables and whatnot seem more a further away and more abstract. And I think also sometimes there's a question of scale, and that if you think about, let's say, a program like Roosevelt's TVA, this was a program that employed directly over 10, 20,000 people, indirectly created a lot more employment, but there were big physical infrastructure projects. And they were also projects that brought together and cohered a workforce that was tied to this government program. It was like a classically developmentalist project that I think the left was very good at in the 20th century, even though some of those projects obviously had all sorts of externalities and weren't great. But I think we need to harness the kind of developmental spirit that says we're going to go out and we're going to build things, we're going to build infrastructure. And obviously, any sort of infrastructure we're building now needs to be built with climate change in mind, needs to be built with the goal of radically reducing emissions. But I feel like the way we haven't really won over people to that vision. I don't really have a great idea of how to do it, other than to say that the existing messaging that we've had around the Green New Deal has been a little bit convoluted, and that I feel like it needs to be just very focused on here are the jobs we're going to create, and here's what the program's about, and it's only about one thing or two things. Whereas I think the Green New Deal has been a catch-all for every single form of climate action and mitigation that we need.
So Build Back Better really could have shown some concrete plans if it was really going to build back better, as your magazine says, build back never.
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate because I think Biden had a really historic opportunity. In a way, a lot of our debate became about how big the bill was going to be. Should it be 5 trillion or 3 trillion or 1 trillion or whatever else? And again, that seemed to me a little bit too abstract. So my fundamental view in all these things is before you get to policy, before you get to any sort of reform you're going to make in a social democratic direction, much less before you get to socialism, you need to start at, do you have a base? Have you been able to win people over to your agenda? Do they trust you? And it feels like in the US, we're at the point where a lot of left-wing politics, even center-left politics in the form of the Democratic Party, has been totally detached from being poor and being working class in America. And we need to start with earning people's trust on a lot of these issues, so they feel like, well, this is the group of people who got us a $15 minimum wage. This is the group of people who got us healthcare. This is a group of people fighting for investment in our community. Then it becomes a lot easier to convince someone of a big nationally scaled environmental plan for radical action on climate change. Because then when the right and the big corporations and fossil fuel power comes to them and says, well, these guys are really just trying to take away your jobs, and they're trying to make you poorer, and you won't be able to fly in an airplane to see your niece across the country or whatever else, then it'll just be seen right off the bat as complete nonsense. Mm-hmm. And that was the type of coalitions that sustained a lot of social democratic politics in the 20th century. Even in the 60s and 70s, in some of these countries that had strong parties, they couldn't convince workers, that the right couldn't convince them that immigration was a huge threat to their livelihoods if those people were entrenched in some type of left-wing politics or unions. Some of the areas in France most resistance, for example, to the rise of the far right and the National Front in France, were the areas with the strongest share of the vote for communists, were the areas with the strongest level of union membership. It is true that a lot of those working class areas ended up going over to the far right, but it was the less organized parts of the working class that went over first, and that's a case historically with where the right has been able to get power. So it's not that I don't care about these issues, but I come from the starting point of thinking our primary challenge right now is to get to a point where we could talk about the egalitarian mission of the left, then the social base of people without much stuff and without much power in our society as one and the same, because that's really the natural home for our politics. We can't do politics alone in ones and twos as activists. Obviously, we sometimes have to. Right now, to a large extent, we have to, but by nature, those are just going to be defensive fights where we could band together and maybe slow down the pace of change that might be bad, instead of really going on the offensive and winning things.
Yeah, the offensive, that's been a hard thing for the Democratic Party to do from day one, it seems. You mentioned trust, and I think that's such a critical issue. Both Bernie Sanders at AOC and Cory Booker, people like that, have definitely developed trust in their communities. And you see that by the way people respond to them all across the country. So it's happening. It's just, we need a lot more of it. And it's just too bad the Democratic Party sabotaged Bernie, in my opinion, which is what they did twice in a row. Now I'm going to go off to something that's completely different, but I really want to get your take on this because it's very, I think, very important right now, and that's cryptocurrencies. If you have any thoughts about that, I mean, when I see libertarians running toward it, the alarm bells go off for me. So my question is, are cryptocurrencies leading once again to a small group of people ultimately controlling a money supply or how it's used? How do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is not much utility in what cryptocurrency wants to offer. Even a lot of the utility of privacy and things like that are kind of overstated. But it is a tool to avoid a lot of regulation. It is a tool to facilitate money laundering and a host of other things. I'm sure there's a few cases in highly authoritarian contexts or government. If you're trying to organize in like Belarus and the government has frozen your bank account, then there might be some uses in other cases in those cases. But in a lot of our contexts here, it's really just been a speculative asset where a lot of people are pumping up the value of new coins and now new speculative digital assets like NFTs. And it's a classic pump and dump scheme. A few people are going to get lucky and ride it and exit the right time. But the people that are really in control of a lot of this price manipulation are going to be big movers in the market. And right now, obviously, that includes even big hedge funds like Blackstone and others that are investing in cryptocurrency. So yeah, I have very negative views. I mean, I think it really is a giant Ponzi scheme, essentially. I think a lot of it is a fraud pushed on people that are investing in this and investing money they can't really afford to lose in a very volatile asset. And there's a reason why a lot of people on the right don't like central banking, because in part it's part of the toolkit potentially of progressive policy. It can also obviously, right now our Fed is going to be used in the next couple of years to possibly engineer a recession to keep down inflation. So obviously it's not always that, but I think we should be wary about tools that take away the ability of governments and the polity as a whole to decide things like macroeconomic policy.
And I wanted to bring up something that you mentioned in your book, The Socialist Manifesto. You quoted Swedish economist Rudolf Meidner, who says, "We cannot fundamentally change society without changing its ownership structure." And of course, this is where Mondragon comes in for me, because the workers are the owners. And I wonder what you think of that in terms of American movements moving toward worker ownership. I certainly know about a lot of cooperatives. One of our most successful ones in California is actually in Sonoma County. It's Alvarado Street Bakery, which has existed since the 70s. And they pay a really good wage. They're all worker owners, and they make decisions about their ownership and about where the money goes. And it's been an extraordinary success, as it's a one-off, not like Mondragon, that's many, many businesses. But I wondered what your thoughts were on worker ownership.
Well, I support cooperatives as kind of a proof of concept that ordinary people don't need big CEOs to tell them what to do. Ordinary workers are the people who know how their firm functions, who can participate in the election of management, and who really can have Republicans and the right often talk about creating an ownership society. And for them, that just means, 2 homes and 3 mortgages. But I think for us, real ownership means being entitled to the fruits of your labor, and not having to, to suffer under the authority of someone else when all they have is what they have by virtue of ownership. So I'm definitely in favor of cooperatives. What I would say is that cooperatives in isolation don't really help us advance to what I think should be our goal, which is a democratic socialist society. And that a democratic socialist society, I think, would be primarily about taking certain key spheres of life out of the domain of the market. So healthcare, for instance, education, even to some extent, education is something that we take it for granted, and it's been under attack by privatizers and underfunded across the country. But the fact is, in the United States, a 5-year-old will get put into a public school system and would, at least in theory, be given the right to a good education and the ability to be literate and learn math and learn training and whatever else. And kind of that aspect of their life will be socialized from then until they're 17, 18 years old. That's not necessarily something that we could have always predicted. That's not something that by nature capitalism was wanted to give us. Capitalism in the beginning had children in the factories and sweatshops for 12, 13 hours a day. We had to demand that. But I think there's many more spheres of life that we should see liberated from the market. Then the question goes, well, what about every other sphere of life? Should restaurants be run by the state? Should you have central planning or whatnot? That's where I get to my support for cooperatives embedded in some sort of social society, where small scale commodity production and all sorts of things are done in a competitive market with worker-owned firms. But I think it is difficult to have isolated worker-owned firms that are in constant competition with other capitalist firms, and without a robust system of public banking that allows new worker-owned firms to be created and that allows successful worker-owned firms to expand. So even Mondragon, I think, is a fantastic example of what can be done at scale by a cooperative, but they've been forced to rely often on contract and temporary labor from people who aren't shareholders in Mondragon and whatever else, because in part they're caught in a lot of the contradictions of capitalism. So I think it's an important question that we need to think a lot more about. But
that's why I want you to come to Mondragon with us, Bhaskar.
Yeah, maybe next year. This year, I don't think I could even apply for the time. I just started the nation in March, so I can't abscond.
We'll talk about that. I wanted to just mention that Mondragon has its own healthcare system. It has its own banking system with 400 branches. It has its own insurance and pensions. They have created an infrastructure that allows them to be, I would say they work to the side of capitalism. I know they have to work within it, but they're not beholden to it the same way an individual cooperative would be, because they've created this incredible infrastructure that really takes care of their worker owners.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is true at any organization at scale, right? But in other words, you wouldn't say that GM and the UAW is outside of American capitalist healthcare firm just because they have a massive group and they're able to negotiate as a group or whatever else. So I definitely agree that there's parts of these experiments that are models and can be inspirations for the future. But I think we fundamentally can't circumvent the need to really take over the state and get people elected and transform the state and make it more democratic. And that those kind of old socialist goals, I think, of taking state power and, obviously in the context of a democracy through elections and through building majoritarian support, I think we could certainly start to build an opposition movement before we get to that point. But I don't think we could avoid that question of state ownership and control, and having worker controlled cooperatives as part of that framework, but not just something on the side floating within capitalism.
Like, I think you and I disagree on that, because I don't see Mondragon ever becoming under a state-owned entity, that it really has created its own separate kind of structure that's phenomenal. And that has grown slowly, but it's never gone backward, and it's been almost 70 years now. So I will really encourage you to come at some point, because I think to experience it and the culture that has grown up around it, the social structure, how it supports it and how the society supports it. But I think, ultimately you're talking about the difference between state-owned and worker-owned, because I do see that as different, but I don't want to end there. I just have one last thing I want to ask before I open it up to questions. You mentioned something about peace being, where did I see this? Peace being something that happens when we don't have war. And I thought this is a really interesting concept, because ever since World War II, we have been, at least in the US, involved in a war somewhere and constantly funding the military at greater and greater amounts. And do you see that if we could actually get to a place of peace, it would be much more conducive to building a socialist movement in the country?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because capitalism will always generate these inter-imperialist rivalries and these competitions. But I do think that the common sense, and a lot of this is credit to the New Left and to the movement against the Vietnam War, but the common sense of Americans is not in favor of war today. I think we could see even the resistance to the Iraq War, the resistance to the war in Afghanistan. We see that it's become much harder for US governments to send people off to die in wars. And obviously we need to push back against the US war machine and its arms exports and whatever else. But I think we should take stock of the fact that there's a common sense in the United States on both the left and even portions of the right that says that money and blood and treasure shouldn't be spent pushing conflicts abroad. So I fundamentally believe that it might sound ridiculous now, but in the same way that we look back today at the division of, let's say, pick any country in Europe and its division into 1,000 different principalities and feudal lords that would muster armies and fight each other and compete over resources, whatever else. One day we'll look back at the existing division of the world into nation states and the division of the world into, rival countries and camps that have nuclear weapons, that have all sorts of ways to destroy each other, as being a fundamentally irrational use of resources. I think as societies become both more wealthy and more connected, this might be the most utopian thing you hear me say, but I do think it will be harder to wage this sort of endless war. Even if you look now at Putin's invasion of Ukraine, this is a conflict where, I for what it's worth, I obviously oppose it, and I think it was an illegal action that should be condemned. But Putin was forced to wage a somewhat limited war. He wasn't able to push, even in the context of being an authoritarian state. He wasn't able to do a full-scale total war conquest of Ukraine. He hasn't drafted or increased conscriptions to send hundreds of thousands of people, like the Russian army is capable of doing, into Ukraine. And they've been very careful to limit the amount of information about true casualties and whatever else going to the public. So even in the context of a authoritarian state in Russia, there's this fear of the people and fear of their resistance to war. And I have to think that in the future, governments will find it very hard to do what the US did in Southeast Asia, what the US did in Iraq, what Russia did in Afghanistan. on a wide scale. I think that's at least one part of the world and politics that we should be happy about on the left. I think things are trending in our direction, and we have a lot of support already.
And it's unfortunate that Putin's aggression into Ukraine has actually enabled an even further expansion of NATO at this point.
Yes, it's really sad. I mean, it's a right-wing, an invasion by a right-wing government has basically boosted the forces of the right wing across the world. Because even if you look at commodity prices spiking, that's terrible for left wing and center left governments across the world. Inflation is a lot worse because of the invasion of Ukraine. We'll see what that means even for Republican Party success in the US right now. In Sweden and Finland, countries with very proud history of neutrality, you're seeing now the expansion of NATO in such a way that's going to help the forces of the right. Germany is going to spend billions of more dollars over the next decade, billions and billions, on arms expenditure. And it's really like led to disastrous, a portion of things. And I think NATO expansion to begin with was a lot of that context, without, of course, taking away the most acute and fundamental, actions were undertaken by Putin. But this happens all around the world. The right, even when they're fighting each other, the right tends to bolster the forces of the right in other parts of the world. Yeah, they don't splinter the way the left often does. I'm going to go to some questions now, if people have questions. It usually takes it. Okay, I see Linda. You want to unmute?
Yeah, we had a good discussion last week, and we kind of left on this question of why there aren't more progressive think tanks. And I just put that out to you. I mean, where are they? The Brookings Institute's one of them, but the right is just awash with them. I'm listening right now to a book by Ann Nevins, Ann Nelson, who has just written a book called The Shadow Network, and it's all about how the right-wing think tanks and other groups have kind of coordinated their efforts, and I don't see that happening on the progressive side. So I think there are some left-wing think tanks, like the Economic Policy Institute is one. There's CEPR, what is that? Center for Economic and Policy Research. There's People's Policy Project, like a much smaller effort. I have some problems with some of their politics. They're a little too conciliatory in some areas, I think, but there's demos as well. So they exist. So the question of why the right has a stronger base of think tanks than the left, I think a lot of it owes to the fact that the right was locked out of certain parts of academia, not all parts, obviously, but certain parts of academia. They felt like they didn't have a great home in academia during the kind of Daniel Bell post-war centrist era. And as a result, they built their project through cohering it together with one national review journal, had a big role in it, but also the right's intellectuals didn't go to academia, they went to think tanks that were part of this kind of outside apparatus. Now, the left was obviously locked out of a lot of parts of academia, but was able to kind of really create a beachhead, and a lot of the great intellectuals of the New Left and onward carved out homes in academia in certain departments. And I feel like a lot of our intellectuals are, by virtue of this history, in academic departments, whereas a lot of their intellectuals are in think tanks. Yeah. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think we're probably are worse off for our place in academia. If you think about before the war, intellectuals used to be largely associated with political parties. Like a lot of the important theorists of the workers' movement were just tied to unions or tied to parties. Even I think some of the most impressive intellectuals of the New Left era, like Braverman is one fantastic intellectual of that period. Actually had experience as as manual workers and as people who kind of Harry Braverman, I mean, who kind of did their best work and learned from being outside of academia. But yeah, I think we do have think tanks to begin with, but I think the reason why we don't have more is because it's kind of sounds like a right-wing cliche, but the left does have a lot of influence in certain academic fields and disciplines and departments. And even where we don't have influence in a lot of these departments, there is a degree to which liberals will tolerate a couple left-wingers in their departments as long as we don't start to dominate them and create too many Marxist graduate students, whereas academia has not been so hospitable to the right.
Yeah, true. But they're not attracted, I guess, to that. I think we have a question from Ben.
Yes, I'm very happy to hear you today, Bhaskar. I've been a longtime subscriber to.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Ben.
And I feel like you have, with Jacobin, you've succeeded in bringing the magazine print format back by making a print version value add. Because anybody who reads it knows that it's chock full of beautiful illustrations. It really is like almost like every issue is like a coffee table, quality. And your cover illustrator is brilliant. Whoever he is a genius.
Yeah, a lot of the credit for the look and feel and design of the magazine is all Rumike Forbes, Jacobin's publisher now and longtime creative director. So a lot of this was me just going along with his good ideas, not really not generating them myself.
Well, I would say that it really works because it gives you a reason to take to print, because everything tends to get flattened when it's digitized.
Exactly.
And the other thing I'm grateful for is to see a magazine on the left, which is becoming a magnet or a pole for a school of thought. And then the people within that school are trying to refine their theory and apply it to various contexts. And for me, it's become it is sort of the center of where I will go for my discourse for starts, is to look to that and kind of work out from there. The one thing I wanted to ask you is, I was for many years also a subscriber to The Nation. And at some point I stopped subscribing because it seemed like they had kind of become under a new editor there, they'd become more like the woke liberal arm of the Democratic Party. And I kind of lost interest. And then I resubscribed after they sent me a free issue. And I said, okay, this is more like The Nation I remember, which was focused on, more like bread and butter structural analysis of capitalism and how, we can find our place within that. The thing that amazed me was that I noticed that you are now listed as the president of the Nation Association. So I wanted you to tell, I'm very curious minds want to know how that happened.
Yeah, so basically the Nation, kind of by accident over the past decade of
I'm having a difficulty. Not quite sure what's happening here.
That's just the Wi-Fi issue. It'll repair if able.
Hopefully it will repair. Bhaskar, if you can hear us, we can't hear you. You seem to be frozen. I'll send him a message.
All right, I just switched to my cell hotspot, so hopefully that's better. I think my internet cut off.
This is much
but yeah, with the Nation, a lot of what I do, or almost entirely what I do, is on the publishing end. So just kind of figuring out ways to boost the circulation, bring in revenue so that the Nation can publish great writers.
I think that one thing that was easier for Jacobin is that because we didn't have much resources, because we were much younger when we started, because it's a younger publication, it was easier to fall into a model that made a lot of sense, which I think you described quite well, which is you still publish a lot every day online. So you're still getting clicks and traffic and attention. But instead of giving someone a weekly magazine, for instance, in addition to all that online material and overloading them, you give them a less frequent, in our case, quarterly, in the case of publications like Mother Jones, like 6 times a year, you give them something a little bit higher quality, a little bit longer, meatier, and it's an occasion when they get it. So they're definitely going to read it. But also it's like relatively, Jacobin's actually quite cheap, but a lot of these publications are relatively expensive. You know, they're higher margin because the web content's all free. And basically when you buy a subscription, you're not only buying the material that's in the print edition, you're also kind of subsidizing the costs of running the rest of the operation. So I think that with The Nation, it was kind of caught in a middle ground where it is used to being America's continuously published weekly publication, but also then it tried to catch up by publishing a lot online. And I think that there might not be space anymore for this kind of very frequent left-wing kind of weekly or even bi-weekly. I think probably people are going to continue to read the New York Times or whatever newspaper they read every day. But for analysis, it's always going to be a step removed. You're never going to expect the print edition of Jacobin or The Nation or in these times to be breaking news. So in any case, I think that part of what I'm trying to do at The Nation is to revamp their website, to kind of put an emphasis on a digital focus, while at the same time, hopefully in the long run, making the print edition more of a special occasion. So some of the things you said about how nice it is when you see an issue of Jacobin and you might agree or disagree with any particular article in there, but you could kind of see it as something that you want to dive into and you don't want to skip, and you certainly are going to throw it away, right? It's not the type of magazine you'll read and toss it, or you'll read and leave on a train or something like that. So maybe The Nation won't go to that extreme. I don't think it can, because it has this history of publishing dozens of times every year in print. But I think it needs to kind of shift a little bit in that direction in the long run.
Yeah, I think once a month might even be better. I know when we got it every week, it was just too much to read it all. It was really too much content when you're reading all these other things as well. Does anyone else have a question for Bhaskar? We may have asked all the questions that they wanted to ask.
Oh.
Here comes
Katie has one.
Okay, Katie, where are you?
Right here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thanks for being here. It's certainly an honor. Trying to still compose my questions, but one of them is, given we've had so much journalism and media under attack and journalists killed all over the world, is there discussion amongst your staff, and is there concern within you about people getting harmed or shot?
Well, no, not necessarily, not at least in the US, and not with the type of work that a lot of us are privileged enough to do, which we often work, from our office or from our homes, but just doing editing and whatever else on a large scale. We do have contributors though that report from places like Kurdistan, or we had a contributor that was actually arrested in Turkey and spent some time under arrest in Turkey. We actually had to work with and help coordinate up with a large solidarity committee of many people, and actually he was luckily enough happened to be a Austrian citizen, so even kind of a not particularly progressive government in Austria at least was on our side to get him released. We have journalists in Kashmir, including one that's still under state detention. So obviously there's contexts in the world. There's where there's going to be a threat, but I think fundamentally we see ourselves mostly as political organizers and activists. and journalism is our means. It's our medium to reach people. But we see a lot of the work we do is kind of being in tandem with people like union activists, with organizers at every level in the United States, and we want to provide some sort of theory and context and kind of provoke thought and debate among this people, and then also ordinary Americans. But we're often doing that through commentary and through being a step removed from things rather than on the ground reporting. And right now, our only beat reporter that we have on staff is someone who covers the labor beat. Other people are just writers and editors. So I definitely think that there's been a dangerous rise of certain types of right-wing extremism, and just more generally, we're a country with a lot of guns and a lot of people who need desperately mental health and support, and they're not getting it. And more often than not, it manifests in things like suicides, and occasionally it manifests in stuff like mass shootings. So, I mean, obviously, don't want to downplay the crisis. I just feel like it probably would be more mainstream journalists doing good work around the country, reporting on gun violence and things like that, like places like the Times that are actually at risk for that sort of stuff.
I wanted to just remind everyone, we have a fast end before.
Yeah, unfortunately, because it's almost 8 here, I need to meet some family members of my fiance and meet people for a dinner around 8. But I can stay right until 8. I'm already
Okay.
dressed for the dinner. So
Good, you're already ready. And congratulations on your coming marriage.
Yes, it is coming next year. I've been engaged since 2019 though, so it's been a while, and it's
The COVID engagement.
Yeah, COVID engagement, exactly.
I'm going to go to Alan next.
Well, I want to say I love your good work. I subscribe to all of it. But I want to ask about National Infrastructure Bank. You know, this House Bill 3339 would give us a National Infrastructure Bank. It seems like that would be a way to solve a lot of our problems, to have access to the funds we would need. Actually, this is what won World War II. Do you have any opinions on that?
To be honest, I know about it. I've heard it referenced. I don't know enough to speak at all fluently about it, but obviously public banking for the funding of big infrastructure projects is just like a normal thing that most countries do and we should do. And obviously I'm familiar with the Dakota kind of public banking system and the way in which it was used for public works projects and all sorts of other things. So that sounds like a good populist demand. I'm happy to read more about it though, but I don't know enough to talk fluently about it. So if you have a suggestion, if you want, for example, I'm not doing day-to-day work at Jacobin now, but if you want to send an email to Jacobin, you could suggest it and I'll forward it to the editors and I'll make sure that someone looks into getting something commissioned on it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Will do.
There are some experts on it. Ellen Brown, who wrote The Web of Debt, and she wrote The Public Banking Solution, is probably one of the experts on public banking in the US.
Right.
And we have had legislation.
Democracy Collaborative, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure if she's with that, but there's some connection there. Yes.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I'll definitely look into. I know of her work, so I'll look into it definitely.
Yeah. So okay. Any last question, and then we will finish. Maybe it looks like we don't.
Ben has one.
I don't see Ben with his hand up.
Right here.
All
right. Well, basically my last question is more of a statement, wanting to amplify on your remarks about in terms of developing a progressive movement that has some strategic, sensibility and some durability. You have to build a base rather than start with a policy argument. Because I feel like in our circles, there's a tendency, because most of us are intellectuals, to be, fascinated with the intricacies of the policy or the proposed reform. But the real question is, how many horses do you But I think that's the question we really have to look at. How do we build a broad progressive base from kind of the liberal left out to the democratic socialist wing? I'm choosing polemically to make the case for progressivism and do my battle on the basis of what does that mean? Because it's one of these very fluid terms. I feel like it's sort of utopian for me to be talking a lot publicly about democratic socialism, when in fact, we haven't even achieved the basic social democracy.
Right.
So I see that as the near-term objective. And I don't know if you wanted to
Yeah. One thing that I would add to that, though, is I do think it's worthwhile thinking about the economics and mechanics of a feasible socialism, because in part, we used to think that socialism was technically possible, but politically impossible.
Mhm.
But I think since the fall of a Soviet system, and other systems that just proved themselves to be authoritarian and also just quite ineffective at delivering the type of welfare we want from a just society. I think among a lot of people, they think that socialism is just kind of a ethic, a way of being, a way of being kind of a generic egalitarian, but they don't actually think that it's feasible to have a fully socialist society. At best, they think we get a few doses of socialism within capitalism. So I've been spending a lot of time reading the work of people like Alec Nove, David Schweikart, who's very interested, obviously, in cooperatives as they exist. There's a host, John Romer. There's a host of thinkers that I think have spent time fleshing out different models of socialism, thinking about these debates around market socialism. And I think it's worth a lot of time just to have the horizon. Because for me, especially because now a lot of my day-to-day is in a more liberal context, having the belief that socialism isn't just morally desirable, but it's technically feasible. And the book I would actually recommend, I'm actually working on a longer form work along these lines right now. But the book that I would recommend is actually called After Capitalism by David Schweikart. I think that's a very good and interesting model. Sam Ginden has written some pieces in Catalyst that have touched on this idea of what socialism could look like. And I think that there's a tendency for us not to feel like this is kind of utopian, what Marx called writing recipes for the cook shops of the future. But I think it really can help fight demoralization now. And obviously, in order to make this abstract vision more credible, you do need the people. You do need the experience of winning day-to-day reforms. If you can't get a $15 minimum wage and a union for people, you're definitely not going to give them all control of the means of production. But I definitely think it's worth keeping alive this vision that there can be, and there should be, and there must be a better world.
Great. Well, I want to thank you so much, Bhaskar, for being with us today and for sharing your knowledge, which has been wonderful, and to answer all our questions. Still have a lot more, but I will send you an email about something else too. So I just want to thank you again. It's been wonderful having you.
Thanks so much. It's been nice to talk to you all, and hopefully we'll get a chance to all meet in the future one day.
That would be great. Maybe we'll have you out for a conference here.
Absolutely. Take care.